Math 3, Unit 7, Section 6. Today we're talking about converting parabolas from general to descriptive form. General form of a parabola looks like this. And descriptive or vertex is when it has the parentheses where you can easily get the vertex from the way the equation is written. So we are going to do this today by completing the square, which we've already had practice with. So one thing I wanted to go back and show you was back in 7.2 when we were completing the square with the circle. And if you were to look at your notes, you'll notice here that our blank term that we have, we are adding them because we are adding them to each side of the equal sign. And today, when we are dealing with the parabola, what you'll notice is that the equal sign here is on the left and our blanks are each going to be on the same side. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, but I just kind of want you to be contemplating, since these aren't going to be on the opposite sides of the equal sign where we're balancing it because we're adding something to each side, how do you make these balance when they're on the same side? So I just want you to think about that for a minute. The first thing that you want to do though, and for pretty much all the problems we're going to be doing today, it says to isolate the variable that is not squared. So if you see an x squared, you're going to solve for y. If you see a y squared, then you're going to solve for x. Most of them are already put in this form though, where it already is y equals or x equals. Once you have that, and it's written in this form, so here you can notice you have an x squared term, so we want y all by itself, and that is what we have here. When you are completing the square, if you notice here, there is a 5 in front of the x squared term. Well, when you're completing the square, you cannot have a coefficient in front, and so we need to factor out the 5. So in this first example here, you can see that the 5 has been factored out. When you are factoring out the 5, you are dividing each of the terms with the x squared by 5. And that is how you end up here with x squared plus 6x. And then we're going to add that plus blank because we want to complete the square. We want this to be a square. The 43, the number that doesn't have an x, is on the outside of the parenthesis. Now, because I am adding a blank here, what will I do in order to balance it? So hopefully you are saying you're going to end up minusing a blank. Because, for instance, if I were to add 3 and subtract 3, do you see how that equals 0? And so basically that's what we're going to do on here. If I'm going to add a value here, if I also subtract it, it's like I didn't do anything, and it's enabling me to transform this problem so that I can have it in vertex form. Now there's another thing about this, is that since we have factored out a 5 here, this is really saying 5 times x squared, 5 times 6x, right? Because this is 5x squared, 30x. So that means this is actually saying 5 times this blank, which means that over here, what should I have? So hopefully you said minus 5 times that blank, because that will make a balanced equation. Okay, the next thing that you do in order to put this in completing the square at vertex form is we take the 6 and we divide it by 2, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. Normally for us in my class, what we do at this point is we write our square. And so if you go down here, this is where we solve our 5 in front, and then we get, because we got 3, we have x plus 3 squared, okay? Then we square the 3, which makes 9, and so the value of 9 is what's going into our blank. So I'm going to write that up here. 9 ends up going into our blanks. And so now we simplify, and we have to simplify these numbers. Okay, so we already have our squared term, and we end up with negative 5 times 9, which is 45. And so if you look over here, this is where they are combining the like terms. and we have 43 minus 45, and that equals a negative 2. And so negative 2 is what goes on the outside of that parenthesis. And for this one, then, now that it's written in this form, so either descriptive or vertex form you can call it, the information that we want to know from this is, well, what is the vertex? And so the vertex is, if you look here, whatever's in parentheses, we set that equal to 0. That gives me x equals negative 3. And the y value is negative 2. They also ask you, well, what's the direction of this parabola? Well, since it's y equals, and my a value there in front is positive, this graph would be going what direction? So hopefully you set up. So I'm going to write up there. And then we have our equation. So we'll practice this here a little more. Also, I just want us to think back here. If it is a y equals graph and you have your f of x formula, if it's adding c, that means it's going to be going up c units. If you have a minus c, it's going down. Inside the parentheses, that means it's going to end up going right. And inside the parentheses with the minus c, it's going, oh my goodness, I said that wrong, sorry. Plus c, you'd set that equal to 0, it's actually going left, and minus c here, it would be going right. All right, over here, notice this one is x equals, so you have y here in your parentheses, so that means this plus c at the end actually means that it is going to the right, minus c is going to the left. Now here it says y plus c, so if you set that equal to 0, we'd end up getting a minus c, and so going up and down, that would end up going down c units, and this one would end up going up c units. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move on to some more examples. So with our first example here, notice that it's set equal to x, and our y squared term is on the right, and so we need to complete the square in order to convert it to descriptive form. So what we're going to do is we're going to write x equals, and we know in order to complete the square, my coefficient in front of the y squared has to be 1. So that means I need to factor out a 4. So we are going to factor out a 4, and when I do that, I'm dividing each of the terms with y by 4. And so what that leaves me with in the parentheses is y squared minus 8y. And then we're going to put plus our blank. On the outside of the parenthesis, the number that doesn't have a y goes on the outside. So we have a plus 61. And then because I have this one blank here, if I'm going to add something in order to make it a balanced equation, I need to subtract the same thing. So right now this is saying 4 times that blank, so what do I need here at the end? Hope you said minus 4 times the blank. And then we're going to complete the square. So we complete the square by taking negative 8 divided by 2, which makes negative 4. For our equation, what do we do with that negative 4? So we put 4 in front still. Because this is a y equation, I have y here in the parentheses, and it's going to be y minus 4 squared. Next, we square negative 4, and that makes the value of 16. So 16 is going into each of my blanks. Now, I've already taken care of this part of the equation. I still have my 4, my square, this factor to be my square, which is y minus 4 squared. And the last thing is I need my number here at the end. And so what I need to do is simplify that. So that ends up being 61, and then negative 4 times 16 is 64. So I have 61 minus 64, which is negative 3. So the value after my parenthesis is negative 3. This is my equation in descriptive form. So we're going to write that on my equation line. X equals 4 parentheses y minus 4 squared minus 3. The direction of this parabola, since it's x equals, is going to be going right and left. It's going to curve right and left because it's x equals. And so that means that because this a value is positive, the direction is going to curve right. The vertex of this parabola, we would set y minus 4 equal to 0, which means the y value of my vertex is going to be 4. So make sure you put that in the y location. And then the number here at the end will go in the x spot, which is negative 3. And we're done. Okay, next problem. You'll notice on this one, it's y equals. You will also notice there's a fraction in front. Again, we cannot have a number in front when we're completing the square. So we're going to do just like we did on the previous example, and we are going to factor out the 1/3. So y equals 1/3, and we are dividing this by 1/3. Well, 1/3 divided by 1/3, that's going to cancel out. We're going to divide 2 by 1/3. You guys know how to do this. So if we were to write this as a division problem, this would be 2 over 1 divided by 1/3. Well, because we have two fractions dividing, we use KFC, and we keep this 2 over 1. We change division to multiplication, and we flip that to 3 over 1. And so 2 times 3 ends up equaling 6. So here in our parentheses, we have x squared plus 6x plus blank. And if you think about it, if you were to multiply 1/3 through here, 1/3 times x squared gives you the 1/3 x squared. 1/3 times 6x would give you 6 over 3, which reduces to be 2. So you can see that it works out correctly. Okay, also because, or here at the end, then we put our plus 4, that doesn't have a letter with it. And then if I have 1/3 times my blank, that means I also need a minus 1/3 times the blank. Next, we will take our b value here, our 6, and divide that by 2, and 6 divided by 2 makes 3. So for my equation, we have y equals 1/3, and in my parentheses, I have x plus 3 squared. Next, we take that 3 and we square it, and 3 squared makes 9. So in my blanks, I get a 9. The last thing I need to do here is figure out what my adding term here is at the end. And so we have to simplify this. And I get 4 minus, and 1/3 times 9, there's lots of ways of thinking about that. But if you want to, you can write that as 9 over 3, because 1 times 9 is 9, 3 times 1 is 3. And then we can simplify or reduce that, and we get 4 minus 3, and that equals 1. So for my equation, we have y equals 1/3. X plus 3 squared plus 1. And that's my equation. So now we can answer all the questions over here. The equation is y equals 1/3 parentheses x plus 3 squared plus 1. The direction of this, because it's y equals, will be up and down. Because my a value is positive, the direction will be up. The vertex is, we set this equal to 0. X plus 3 equals 0 will give me a negative 3 for the x value, which means the 1 is my y value. Okay. We're going to go ahead and do a couple more examples. So moving on. Okay, here again we have another y equals equation. Notice this time you have a negative 2 in front here. So just like we've done already, we are going to now factor out a negative 2. Now that's going to change a couple things. So be thinking about the fact that this is now a negative number, where previously that was a positive number we are factoring out. I always like to divide each of these terms by the value that I'm factoring out, so it's easy for me to see the changes. So here, negative 2 divided by negative 2 does make an x squared. 4 divided by negative 2 makes a negative 2x. Same thing as before here, we're going to have plus our blank. My number here at the end is a minus 5. But here's another change. This says negative 2 times a blank. So in order to balance this one, if I have another negative 2 blank over here, I would have two negative numbers, I would add them together, and I'd get a much bigger negative number. We want them to balance out so they actually would make 0. So hopefully you are thinking that since this is negative 2 times the blank, we are going to need a positive 2 times the blank in order to balance it out. If you need to think about that a little more, you can go back to the previous examples and you'll notice we are multiplying a positive times the blank, so we needed a negative times the blank to balance it. Here it just starts with the negative times the blank, so that means we needed a positive times the blank in order to balance. All right, from here now, we will find our square value. So negative 2 divided by 2 equals negative 1. So if I write my square, we have y equals negative 2 parentheses x minus 1 squared. We square negative 1, and that makes a positive 1. So positive 1 goes into each of my blanks. My last thing is 2 combined terms here. And so we end up with negative 5, and then 2 times 1 makes 2. So negative 5 plus 2 equals negative 3. So we write our minus 3 here, and we have our equation. So we're going to go ahead and finish our questions over here. We have y equals negative 2 x minus 1 squared minus 3. That is a y equals equation now. So that means my graph is going to go up or down. Because the a value here is a negative, that means it's going to go down. The vertex, we set our parenthesis equal to 0, and so that will be x equals 1. So in my vertex, x equals 1, and then the y value is negative 3. Okay, last equation we're going to look at for these notes. Here we notice it's x equals, we have a 4 in front. Same thing as we've done, we want to always factor out that coefficient in front. I'm going to divide each of these terms by 4. I end up with y squared minus 4 divided by 4 is 1. So I'm just going to write that as minus y. If you want to put 1y, that's fine. Plus our blank. And then I have plus 7/8. Since this is a positive 4 times the blank, we need a minus 4 times the blank. So remember, we're always balancing. If this one's positive, this one's negative. If this one was negative, then this one would be positive. Next, in order to complete the square, this value was negative 1. We've talked about that. We take negative 1 and we divide it by 2. That is now in reduced form. So I write my equation. I get x equals 4 parenthesis, and that will be y minus a half squared. Next, we square this, and you're squaring everything in this parenthesis. So negative 1 squared is negative 1 times negative 1, which makes a positive 1. And then we're squaring the 2, so that's 2 times 2, which makes 4. We have 1/4 in each of these blanks. The last thing we need to do is simplify our term here. And I would have 7/8 minus, and again, there's multiple ways of doing this, but I'm going to go 4 times 1, which is 4, over 4 times 1, which is 4, and that does reduce to 1, but 1's not going to be helpful in this case because I have a denominator of 8 here. We know that anytime we have fractions, they need common denominators. My common denominator is going to be 8, so this one's going to stay as 7. Here I multiply by 2 to the top and the bottom in order to make the denominator 8. 4 times 2 makes 8 on the top, and when I subtract, I get negative 1/8. So minus 1/8 goes here at the end of my equation. Now we can fill in our information. So my equation is x equals 4 parenthesis y minus 1/2 squared minus 1/8. Based on this information, and this is saying x equals, we know it's going to be right and left for the direction of my parabola, and because my a value is positive, we know the direction will be right. Finding the vertex, our parenthesis we set equal to 0, and when I do that, I'm going to get y equals 1/2. So in the y spot, I need to put 1/2, and the x spot is negative 1/8. And then we have our vertex. And that is it. Your homework is Unit 7, Worksheet 6, all numbers. And if you have questions, I can answer them tomorrow.